It was a bitterly cold Christmas Eve in the heart of a small, snow-covered town in the USA. The moon hung low, its pale light casting twisted shadows over the jagged outline of the old house at the end of the lane. They said no one had stepped foot inside for decades, not since the Christmas of 1953. The house loomed like a beast slumbering under the weight of its own decay. Its peeling paint and sagging roof gave it a skeletal appearance, while the broken shutters clattered softly against the icy wind, like skeletal fingers tapping against unseen glass. I didn't want to be here, not at this hour, but I had no choice. The front door groaned on rusted hinges as I pushed it open. The sound echoed through the cavernous darkness like a warning. My boots crunched on the frosted wood of the porch, and the first step into the house felt like crossing a threshold I couldn't come back from. Inside, the air was thick, stifling, almost alive. The faint scent of mildew mingled with something sharp and metallic, like old blood. My flashlight beam trembled as it slid over torn wallpaper and splintered furniture. The floors creaked under my weight, each sound swallowed by the heavy silence of the house. Then it started. The sound. A faint, rhythmic scrape coming from somewhere deeper in the house. It was subtle at first, like the whisper of a branch against glass, but it grew louder, closer. My breath hitched, fogging in the freezing air. "Hello," I called out, my voice barely above a whisper, as though afraid to disturb whatever was here. No answer, only the scraping sound, now joined by the faint, hollow clink of metal. I followed the noise down the long, narrow hallway. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows pressing against me. Something was wrong. More than the emptiness of the house, more than the cold. It felt like I was being watched. The flashlight flickered, plunging me into darkness for a heartbeat before sputtering back to life. That's when I saw them. Footprints in the dust, leading further into the house. They weren't mine. The sound came again, now louder, more deliberate. It was coming from the room at the end of the hall, the old parlor, with its bay windows rattling in the wind. I could see faint lights spilling out into the hallway, flickering like candlelight. My heart thundered in my chest. I stepped closer, one foot after the other, the weight of the silence crushing down on me. As I reached the doorway, the sound stopped abruptly, leaving only the howl of the wind outside. Then, from the corner of the room, a voice. Low, whispered,
Hello.
unmistakably human. "You shouldn't have come." A chill ran down my spine. That voice, that faint whisper,
Hello.
was so close it felt like someone had spoken directly into my ear. I swung the flashlight toward the room, its beam trembling in my unsteady grip. But the room was empty. Only the flicker of dim, sickly light remained, casting wavering shadows that seemed to dance with malicious intent. The floor was covered with an old, threadbare rug, its edges singed and curling. Torn paintings hung on the peeling walls, their subjects blurred with age and grime. In the far corner, a rocking chair creaked, swaying ever so slightly, as if someone had just vacated it. My heart pounded violently in my chest. Steeling myself, I took a cautious step into the room. That's when the voice came again, clearer this time, cold and deliberate. "You opened the door. Now you can't close it." The words lingered, echoing through the suffocating silence. My hands trembled as I tried to muster some courage. "Who's there? What do you want?" I demanded, though my voice betrayed my fear. No response. Instead, I felt it, a faint vibration beneath my boots. It wasn't just the creaking of old wood. It was something moving beneath the floorboards, pacing, restless. The sensation grew stronger, and then a low, guttural laugh seeped into the room, sending shivers through me. "You've made a mistake." Suddenly, the door of an old wardrobe burst open with a violent crash. I stumbled back, the flashlight slipping from my grip and clattering to the floor. The beam landed on the wardrobe's interior, revealing nothing but an expanse of darkness, so deep, so suffocating, it seemed alive, reaching out to pull me in. The light flickered erratically, and that's when I noticed it. The eyes in the paintings. They were moving, Slowly, deliberately, they turned toward me, their cold, painted stares locking onto mine. Sweat beaded on my forehead, despite the freezing air. I wanted to run, but when I turned, I realized the door I had entered through was now shut tight. There was no exit in sight. The floor beneath me groaned, and thin tendrils of smoke began to seep through the cracks, curling and twisting around my ankles. The whispers were back, louder this time, surrounding me, circling like vultures. "This is your last night," the voice hissed, its tone dripping with malice. The soft, eerie laughter from beneath the floorboards grew louder, and smoke began to curl around my feet, as if an invisible hand was trying to hold me in place. My breathing quickened, panic rising in my chest. I could feel my heart racing, every beat thunderous. With all my strength, I tried to open the door, but it refused to budge. It was as if something, or someone, was stopping me. Suddenly, the faces and the paintings on the walls began to change. What once seemed faded and lifeless now felt alive. Their lips moved, and all together they began to chant in unison. "There is no way back." My breath hitched in my throat. My eyes shot back to the wardrobe, now completely open. The darkness inside it was so deep, it seemed to pull at me, almost calling me closer. And then a hand, a long, thin, shadowy hand, emerged from the darkness. It wasn't human. Its fingers stretched impossibly long, brushing the ground below. My body froze, and I tried to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. The hand moved slowly, deliberately, reaching toward me. I stepped back in panic, but something cold and rigid pressed against me from behind. I turned around, and my feet froze. The rug had vanished, and in its place, a deep, dark pit had formed. The flickering firelight from within, it was so unnatural. The voices from below, they weren't from this world. They were otherworldly. "This is your fate." The whisper didn't just echo around me. It felt like it was coming from deep within me. A cold shiver ran down my spine as I stood there, trapped between the dark forces pulling me in both directions. I jerked myself out of the trance and grabbed my flashlight, shining it toward the wardrobe. But there was nothing there anymore. The darkness had disappeared. Yet, as I turned away, my heart stopped. A mirror had appeared inside the wardrobe. This wasn't an ordinary mirror. Its surface was clouded with mist, and it didn't reflect me. Instead, it showed a different scene, a scene from the very room I was standing in. But this time, I wasn't alone. Behind my reflection, a dark shadow loomed. Slowly, it moved closer. I was rooted to the spot, unable to move, unable to breathe, as the shadow closed in. "You opened the door. Now, you will see the final secret." My heart pounded in my chest, each beat louder and faster as the shadow stepped out of the mirror. And then, everything went black. The cold wind howled through the empty corridors of the abandoned house, its icy breath rattling the old windows. The floorboards creaked beneath my hesitant steps, each sound echoing like a warning. A chill ran down my spine, not from the cold, but from something darker, something watching. I shivered, not from the cold, but from the oppressive weight of the atmosphere. Something was wrong here, terribly wrong. It clung to the air, thick and suffocating. Every corner seemed to be hiding a secret. The house stood silent, as if holding its breath. Dust particles floated in the air, illuminated by the faint beam of my flashlight. The room ahead was cloaked in darkness, but something about it called to me, luring me deeper into the unknown. A faint whisper reached my ears. It wasn't the wind. It was too clear, too deliberate. It was closer, much closer. "Who's there?" I asked, my voice trembling, barely audible in the silence. No answer, only silence. But then, a low, guttural laugh erupted from beneath the floorboards. The sound made my heart race, each beat thunderous in my chest. It was as though the house itself was alive, mocking me. I stepped forward, shining the flashlight across the room. The beam landed on an old, threadbare rug, its edges burnt and curling. A rocking chair sat in the corner, swaying gently, as though someone had just been sitting there. I swallowed hard, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. And then I saw it. The wardrobe. Its doors suddenly burst open with a deafening crash, revealing nothing but an abyss of darkness so deep it felt alive. The air grew colder, heavier. The darkness inside the wardrobe seemed to move, to reach out. It felt like it was pulling me in. You opened the door. Now, you can't close it. I stumbled back, my flashlight slipping from my hands. My breath came in shallow gasps as shadows on the walls began to shift, their forms twisting unnaturally. The eyes in the old painting stared at me now, following my every move. They seemed to be alive, tracking my every step, as though they knew the end was near. My breathing quickened as I realized the door I had entered through was gone, vanished. A creeping panic began to rise inside me. And then, the floor beneath me cracked, and from those cracks, smoke began to rise. It curled around my legs, cold and constricting, as if it were alive. I could feel it, pulling me closer to something terrible. "This is your last night," the whisper hissed again, sending a tremor through my spine. Before I could react, the rug disappeared, revealing a jagged stone staircase descending into the darkness. I wanted to turn back to run, but an invisible force shoved me forward. I resisted, but my body betrayed me, my feet dragging me down step by step into the depths below. At the bottom, I found myself in a dimly lit chamber. Ancient, flickering torches lined the walls, casting strange shadows that seemed to writhe and twist. It felt like the walls were closing in on me, the darkness around me thickening, suffocating. In the center of the room stood a stone table, and atop it was a mirror, but this was no ordinary mirror. Its surface shimmered, revealing scenes not of my reflection, but of a memory I had buried long ago. A sickening realization hit me as I saw the memory unfold in front of me. I saw myself on a dark road, behind the wheel of my car. Headlights blaze. There was a figure, someone I had hit. I remembered now. I had fled the scene. I left them there, bleeding, calling for help. A wave of guilt washed over me, choking me. The voice returned, louder this time. "Every sin must be repaid. Tonight, your debt is due." The mirror began to ripple, and from its surface, a shadow emerged. It had no face, yet somehow it was me. It moved like me, it stood like me, but its presence was utterly malevolent. The shadow grinned, stepping out of the mirror entirely. Its voice, a mockery of my own, said, "Now I will live your life, and you will stay here forever." I tried to scream, but my voice failed me. My heart pounded, racing with fear as the ground beneath me crumbled, and I was pulled into the mirror's depths. When I opened my eyes, I was trapped inside the mirror. I could see the world outside, but I was no longer part of it. The cold, suffocating darkness surrounded me. On the other side, my shadow, my replacement, walked away, free to live my life. The mirror's surface shimmered once more, and a final message appeared. "This prison is for all who run from their sins." The lesson of this story is, you can never escape your sins. No matter how hard you try to bury the past, it always follows you. Always. This story serves as a warning that the choices we make are not easily erased, and if we refuse to confront them, they will trap us in an endless cycle of punishment. The mirror in this story, it's not just an object. It's a symbol, a reflection of the truths we try to hide. Every time we turn away from our sins, they rise up to expose us. And in the end, the protagonist ignored their wrongdoings, and they became a part of them. But the greatest lesson here is simple. You must face your sins, because you can't outrun them. No matter how hard you try, they'll always find you. That's the twist, the moment when everything changes, the moment you realize there's no escaping the price we must pay for our actions.
What would you do if a stranger knocked on your door this Christmas Eve, claiming to be lost? Would you help them? Or would you be afraid that something was off? Stay with us until the end to find out what happened when the Morgans unknowingly invited something far darker than they could ever imagine. It was the kind of Christmas Eve where the snow fell softly, coating everything in a layer of pure white. The fireplace crackled with warmth, and the scent of roasted turkey filled the air in the Morgan family's cozy house. The family gathered around the dinner table, laughing, sharing stories, and enjoying the holiday cheer. For a moment, it seemed like the perfect night. But as the wind howled outside, things began to take an unsettling turn. There was a knock at the door. At first, it seemed like an innocent interruption. The Morgans had no visitors planned for the night. In fact, they'd expected the evening to be quiet after their guests had left. But the knock echoed through the house, sending an inexplicable chill down Mrs. Morgan's spine. She looked at her husband, a question in her eyes. Mr. Morgan, curious, stood up from the table and walked to the door. Was it a traveler lost in the snowstorm, or something else? When he opened it, standing there on the doorstep, was a man dressed in a dark coat and a hood. Snow clung to his coat, but his eyes were hidden beneath the shadow of his hood. His face was obscured, and there was something deeply unsettling about the way he stood. He was just too still, like he wasn't quite real. "May I come in?" the stranger asked, his voice soft and almost too calm for such a cold night. "I've lost my way. The storm is worse than I thought, and I saw your light." There was something about his voice. It didn't sit right. Without thinking, Mr. Morgan stepped aside, allowing the man into their home. The firelight flickered unnaturally as the stranger entered. The warmth of the room, once so inviting, suddenly felt suffocating. The air grew heavier with every step the man took. He didn't speak much after that. He simply sat in the corner, his eyes fixed on the flickering flames in the hearth. The family tried to continue with their dinner, but it felt forced now, like the conversation was merely a distraction. The children, who had been excited and full of joy, grew unnervingly quiet. They looked toward the stranger with a mix of fear and fascination, but no one dared to speak. As the evening stretched on, the feeling in the room became thicker, tenser, almost as though the walls themselves were closing in. The wind howled outside, but inside, the house seemed to hold its breath. Then, just as midnight approached, something changed. Without warning, the man stood up. His movements were slow, deliberate, almost unnatural. He didn't make a sound as he crossed the room, his gaze never leaving the fire. Why was he leaving so suddenly? The family watched, their eyes wide, as he made his way toward the door. His face was still hidden beneath the hood, but there was a sense of finality in his steps. He opened the door and stepped out into the blizzard, disappearing into the night. The door slammed shut behind him, and the room went silent. But then, that's when it happened. The candles on the dinner table flickered out all at once, as if blown by an unseen wind. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, and the air felt heavy, thick with dread. Mr. Morgan stood frozen for a moment, looking at the empty space where the man had been. It was then that Mrs. Morgan noticed something strange. The family portrait on the wall, the one they had taken just a week before, had changed. The faces in the picture hadn't shifted, but in the reflection of the glass, there was someone standing behind them, watching. The stranger. But no one had been standing there. No one had left the room. Mr. Morgan turned around quickly, heart pounding, but there was nothing. The room was empty. He rushed to the window, but the snowstorm outside had completely erased any trace of footprints in the fresh snow. What had just happened? His mind raced as he pieced it together. The man, the stranger, hadn't been just a lost traveler. He had been something else, a figure from the past. The ghost of a man who had been murdered on that very night, years before, in a brutal Christmas Eve crime that had never been solved. His restless spirit had returned, seeking closure, seeking the family who unknowingly lived in the house where his life had been stolen. Mr. Morgan felt a cold shiver run down his spine as he understood. The stranger had been a visitor, an uninvited guest from beyond the grave, seeking the family he had been connected to in life, or perhaps those who now lived where he had died. The question lingered in the air like a silent scream. What had he come for? Then, as the minutes passed, a deeper realization set in. The family portrait had been altered. The man's face wasn't a trick of the light. It was a warning, a reminder that some spirits never rest. Some ghosts linger, unable to move on until they find the peace they never had. This Christmas Eve, the Morgans learned a chilling lesson. When the past comes knocking, sometimes it brings more than memories. It brings unfinished business. Lesson: some spirits are forever tied to the places they haunt, and when we open our doors to strangers, we might not be letting in just anyone. It was Christmas Eve, the most wonderful time of the year, or so everyone thought. Snowflakes gently fell from the night sky, blanketing the small town in a peaceful, serene white. The scent of fresh pine and cinnamon filled the air, and the streets were lined with glowing lights that twinkled like stars. For the Henderson family, this time of year had always been magical. They were well known in the town for their extravagant Christmas dinners, and this year was no different. Invitations had been sent to close friends, family members, and even a few strangers who had nowhere else to go. The grand mansion at the edge of town was decorated to perfection, with towering Christmas trees and garlands of gold and red, the fireplace crackling with warmth. The guests arrived with laughter and joy, exchanging gifts and stories, basking in the holiday cheer. But beneath the surface of this perfect holiday gathering, something was not right. From the moment the guests stepped through the front door, an overwhelming sense of dread washed over them. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable at first, like the heavy silence that sometimes follows an unsettling thought. The Hendersons, usually so full of warmth and hospitality, seemed off. Their smiles were too forced, their eyes too vacant. The way they spoke felt hollow, as if they were merely going through the motions of what Christmas should be, but none of the joy reached their hearts. The atmosphere grew even more uncomfortable as the night wore on. The dinner bell rang, and the guests were ushered into the grand dining room, where an extravagant spread awaited them. The long wooden table was covered in rich dishes: roasted turkey, mashed potatoes, honey-glazed ham, and an assortment of pies and cakes. But as the guests began to eat, something strange happened. The lights in the room flickered for just a moment, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. The warmth of the fire seemed to fade, replaced by a sudden, bone-chilling cold. One by one, the guests began to notice it. A low, almost imperceptible whisper coming from the shadows in the corners of the room. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, but when anyone tried to listen closely, they couldn't make out the words. A strange unease settled over the room, but no one dared to voice their concerns. They continued to eat and drink, trying to push the uncomfortable feeling to the back of their minds. But then, as the clock struck midnight, the door to the mansion slammed open with a gust of icy wind that sent the candles flickering. A chilling voice, barely audible, whispered through the house, "The curse is back." Panic spread through the room as the guests realized that something far darker than a simple Christmas curse was at play. The Henderson smiles faded completely, replaced by cold, empty stares. They were no longer the joyful hosts they once were. They had become something else entirely, and that something was slowly but surely taking over the house. As the guests tried to flee, they found the doors and windows locked tight, as if the house itself had sealed them in. The guests, now trapped inside, began to panic. The sounds of footsteps echoed through the hallways, but there was no one to be seen. The air became heavy with a malevolent presence, and the guests' breath turned to ice in the air. One by one, the guests started to vanish. The first to disappear was Mr. Jenkins, a close family friend. He was sitting by the fire when the shadows seemed to swallow him whole. No one saw him leave. No one heard a sound. He was simply gone. Then Mrs. Porter, a neighbor, disappeared next. She was standing near the window when the room grew colder, her face contorted in fear, and she vanished into the air, leaving nothing behind but a lingering scream. The Hendersons did nothing to stop it. They simply watched as the guests were taken, their eyes empty, as if they had seen this happen before. As the number of guests dwindled, the truth began to emerge. The Hendersons were not just a family. They were the cursed keepers of a terrible secret, one that was bound to this very house, this very holiday. Years ago, the Henderson family had made a dark pact. In exchange for eternal wealth and prosperity, they had agreed to serve an ancient, malevolent spirit, a spirit that haunted the mansion each Christmas Eve, demanding a blood sacrifice. Every year, one soul would be claimed by the spirit, and the curse would continue to claim more until the pact was broken. The remaining guests, now fewer than 5, began to piece together the story. The curse had taken hold of the Hendersons, and every Christmas, they were forced to offer up the lives of others to keep their wealth and status. The guests were not just random visitors. They had been chosen to feed the curse, to keep it alive. But there was a way out. According to the stories the Hendersons had tried to bury, there was a way to break the curse. To do so, they would need to face the spirit head-on and break the pact that had been made centuries ago. But the guests had to act quickly before the spirit returned to claim the last of them. In a desperate final act, the remaining survivors searched the mansion for clues, piecing together fragments of the cursed family history. They found an old journal hidden in the attic, written by the first generation of Hendersons who had made the pact. The journal contained the incantation needed to banish the spirit, but it came at a price. Only one person could survive, and that person would need to offer their life in exchange for the others. As the spirit's presence grew stronger, the guests realized that they had no choice. They had to face the curse or die trying. They gathered in the main hall, where the last remnants of the Christmas spirit had faded into darkness. One by one, they chanted the incantation. But just as the final words left their mouths, the spirit appeared, its form twisting and contorting in the cold air. The battle was long and brutal. The spirit fought fiercely, but in the end, the curse was broken. The mansion seemed to breathe a sigh of relief as the presence lifted, and the last remaining guest was freed. But as the first rays of sunlight broke through the windows, the curse had been lifted, but at a terrible cost. The mansion, once full of life and warmth, stood empty. The guests had vanished, their souls released, but the Hendersons remained behind, lost forever, bound to the house by the pact they had made. The mansion itself would soon crumble into ruin, a haunting reminder of the terrible price of greed and the curse that had haunted the Henderson family for generations. Lesson: sometimes the price of power and wealth is far greater than we can imagine. What we gain in material riches may cost us the very thing that makes life worth living: our souls. The Hendersons learned too late that the true curse is not the one we inherit, but the one we create ourselves.
If you enjoyed this terrifying tale, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a chilling story. Your support helps us create even more thrilling content, and we're so grateful to have you with us on this terrifying journey. Thanks for watching, and remember, once you subscribe, the nightmare never ends.